Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value-creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a Soka researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, this is Mandy Krause, and I'm based out of Lake Forest, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. And I'm currently a seventh grade teacher at a public school with an elementary, secondary, public, and private background. So kind of, all trades.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mandy, for joining me on the podcast. I'm very, very happy to have you. I think that, your career up until now, right? You say you're a seventh grade teacher, but there's so much in between that I really want to dig into. And being that we're both in the same master's program at Harvard, just feel very fortunate to have learned so much from your insight and also just how eloquent you speak. I feel like, there's so many amazing speakers in our program, but you definitely count among them. So not raising oh no, now they're going to be like hyper vigilant on how I'm speaking, but just really wanted to sing some of your praises and say that I'm happy that you're here to speak a little bit about global citizenship, a little bit about your journey. So, with that, I'd like to ask if you can share some of the milestones that got you to where you are, like kind of the educator journey. And you can take us as far back as you'd like. I just love to hear from you. How did you get to where you are now?
Well, first, thank you so much, Scott, for having me. I listened to the show, loved the show, and just feel like I've learned so much about the people in our cohort in this like really genuine way that it's so enriching to know so much about them on such a deep level. So I really appreciate, the podcast existing and you featuring us. It's just been really nice. I'm from a suburb of Milwaukee. Actually, I'm from a North Shore suburb of Milwaukee, and it's kind of funny because I had what I viewed at the time as like a very archetypal childhood in that I'm from the Midwest, but my kind of existence in school and high school being from a suburb of a major city is very similar to like a John Hughes movie, and just kind of this image that what I found later on that the rest of the world has of what it's like to grow up American. And I didn't realize that at the time. I found that once I was abroad. And it's kind of ironic because now I live in the North Shore suburbs of Chicago, and I actually like live in John Hughes land where like the Home Alone house is nearby, and like the place where like my kid dances is like the John Hughes Theater. So it's kind of funny. But I just so I had that kind of upbringing in terms of like what my school looked like and what kind of my town looked like. And we were about 15 minutes from downtown Milwaukee. So we had access to, a lot in that way. But I was fortunate enough to have some global exposure really early. The summer after freshman year in high school, I was like a student ambassador in Australia. I did like a program there, and it was neat because they took us all over, and they took us to Sydney, and we were in Queensland, and we were in the Outback, and it was one of those experiences where it seems like the most amazing thing ever, but you're on the tourist track. And, I came back from that just being so exhilarated and thinking like, I want to go back. I want to live there. And I immediately applied for AFS to be like an AFS exchange student. And I got in, and it was just really interesting that once I was there for real, my junior year in high school, to see how different it is living when you're not on the tourist track of a country. That a lot of people, they think of the U.S. and there's kind of like this joke of like, oh, where shall we go? And I think in Coming to America with Eddie Murphy, when they're deciding where they're going to go, they're like, well, if we're going to go to the U.S., where should we go? We should go to, or will we be going to New York or L.A.? And it's like, well, because what else exists in terms of like media? And it's interesting that even in another country, and they were speaking English, so people assume it's very similar to the US, but really it was very different and similar in a lot of ways. But how much like here, if you're not on this tourist track of like Sydney to another major city to, the area in Queensland where you go if you're going to go in the Barrier Reef. And I got put in a kind of a small mining to like what was historically a mining town, like 2 hours north of Melbourne, called Bendigo. And I mean, it was just it just really showed, kind of like what the real of the country was, like a much more genuine experience of what it was like there. Just like if you had been in the US and been put somewhere that was not a major city in the US. So just to have that perspective really early, that was really fortunate. And it's funny too, because I never thought of it at the time from like a global citizen perspective. But I looked it up just before coming on the show of, just reminding myself what AFS stood for, because I knew it had, something to do with hospital drivers that had volunteered during World War I and World War II. But it's interesting because now on their website, it says like huge, be an active global citizen, that they're marketing it in that manner now that it's known like that's what students need to be. And that's what like we need to be as a society. So it's just interesting kind of like looking back that was my exposure so young, uh, in school. But I came back from that. So while I was there, a couple like things happened that just got me really interested in kind of an international perspective. I got put at a school that was huge. It had a couple thousand kids there, the high school, and it had an open campus. And again, being used to bells and lockers, that was very different. And then also at the time, at least, their education system was different in that things didn't count towards college in terms of grades until they were in year 12, like the equivalent of our senior year. So the entire kind of American system of being college focused from the beginning and your grades all counting, that it meant that more of the youth at the school kind of were very separated from what happens next, than maybe might be at a typical American high school, because there isn't necessarily a consequence. So with an open campus and grades not necessarily counting until they're the senior, it was just very easy to feel lost amidst that, when that was so different than my experience, that was so much more controlled. And I had a rock thrown at me on the blacktop, kind of like the playground outside equivalent, because I was an American and we had recently invaded Iraq. And it just, I think it just showed me really early that even when you think, things don't have to do with you specifically, or, I don't come from a military family in terms of like the current generation or anything, that to have that identified with me while I was there, that we as Americans had just invaded Iraq, because this is 2003. So we, this is the next year, that was very illuminating. And while I was there, I watched a lot of Parliament on television, and I just got really into government and politics. And then when I came back, I had a heightened appreciation for school and my school, and just having seen how different school, at least the school that I went to, because I know a lot of people had different experiences. They were put in private schools there, they were put all over the country, but at least going to the public school that I was put in there, that was so large, that when I came back to my like microcosm of Americana with prom and everybody's cars and, just the whole thing, that I was just like, oh, I love my life. I'm so appreciative that like I have teachers that care about me and, are just so connected to my whole experience growing up and the whole thing. And I just, but I wanted to go and become a political journalist, and that's what I wanted to do. So I originally applied to school to do that, and then ended up going to school in DC originally to do that. So I applied to George Washington University, and I was there. And when I was there, I very quickly realized I hate interviewing people. So, and, uh, and this seems kind of out of date now, but, I have my hands messed up from a horse accident. I had a camp when I was little, and it was hard for me to write fast. So between like not liking interviewing people and not being able to write fast, even though I was on the paper there, I found it like very difficult to enjoy interviewing. And I mean, now that seems ridiculous because everything would be recorded, but everyone was still, walking around with a pen and a paper. And I was just like, oh, I'm not going to be able to do this. And I also thought like there's going to be enough kids or, young adults that enjoy doing this, that I'm never going to be good if I don't love it. And I was like, well, what else could I do? And the other thing that I loved and I care about is I was a really avid reader. And I loved reading, and it was really important to me growing up. And I was a Harry Potter fanatic. And that was really important to me. Just, I don't know if you've ever seen Boyhood, the movie by Richard Linklater, where he
I've
like
heard of it.
films.
Yeah.
Yeah, it like was up for all these Oscars in like 2013, 14 or something. But he films like every single year, this kid growing up, and they kind of show the progression of time by the kid going to Harry Potter release parties, like book release parties, and the movies coming out. And that's very much what like my experience was. And there was nothing, it felt like there was nothing to read when I was really young. And I hit like that 5th grade moment where you're too young for adult books, and you've kind of grown out of everything that either they read in school, Narnia's done. And I remember going to the bookstore with my mom and her being like, what can she read? And there was just like this very tiny little shelf. And then when Harry came out, the entire genre of adolescent literature and young adult literature exploded. And like kids now have no idea, what it was like when none of the whole genre that exists now didn't exist. And I remember every time we went to one of those book parties, there seemed to be more and more option for like middle schoolers to read. But I thought that it was like a really special moment, this kind of explosion of youth literature. And I was like, well, if I'm not going to be a journalist, the other thing that I care a lot about, other than like politics and news, is I care about reading. So I want to be part of that moment of like this influx of literature for kids. So I want to pursue publishing, and specifically children's publishing. And then I found out that I needed an English major to do that. And so I switched to an English major. And then I was told very quickly by some professors that I was at a school that, while they had an English major, it was a school for people pursuing international affairs and journalism and government. And that if I wanted to pursue publishing, that I should go to a school with an English department that was more known for that and had more opportunities in that realm. So I ended up transferring to NYU. And then that's how I ended up in the city. And then while I was there, even though I had already left behind journalism, I kind of still had this itch where like it still made me happy, even though I like didn't like interviewing people. So every time an opportunity came up to intern, and everyone there is an intern junkie, like a lot of the kids in those schools. And it becomes this very conspicuous consumption type of like, what internship do you have? Where you'll be like in a class, like an internship class where you talk about, business or something, and everyone's sitting around a board table, and they go around and they say, oh, introduce yourselves, and then tell us like where you've interned most recently. And some kid will be like, well, I work at MoMA, and I work at the Olympics, and I work at Condé Nast. And like, it was that kind of competitive intern junkie atmosphere. And I was part of that, like willingly. But in that, I interned at the New York Daily News, and I was a web editorial intern, and I got to like publish stories. And it's like, I should have been at Penguin, or, I should have been at HarperCollins doing the publishing internship. But then this kind of opportunity came up where it's like, oh, would you like to work in the newsroom? And I was like, well, even though I've decided not to pursue journalism, that seems like an amazing life experience. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm like, okay, now, next summer I'm going to do the publishing thing. And then I got an offer to intern at Time. And again, for like a newsy person, it was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to work at Time magazine. And it was during the 2008 election, and they were tied to CNN. So I would get to like work at CNN Politics 2008. And it was just like, I should be doing this, but this seems like a very enriching life experience. So I'm going to go do that. And I kept doing that over and over. And then I went abroad while I was there, and I was in Italy, and I wanted to volunteer and just kind of like take more in from that experience. And I volunteered to teach. And I was put in a high school with a lot of kids where my only kind of thing I needed to do was be speaking with them. And they said, kind of, you can talk about whatever you want. You can teach whatever topics you want. They wanted to have fluid discussion and all of that. And I taught like about media and politics. And like one day I had a lesson just on the American political system. And I like talked about the 2000 election and just kind of nerded out with like my middle school West Wing self. And I enjoyed doing that so much. And it made me so happy, which was confusing because then when I came back, I was like, okay, I'm being primed for this world where it's all about what internship do you have? Where are you going to work? What are you going to do? And very status oriented, and then very label oriented. Even like every time I flew on the plane and I'd run into someone, who was going to Columbia or Barnard, and they'd be like, well, where are you interning this semester? And there was just this pressure with that. And then I enjoyed teaching more. But then it was interesting because every single time I met someone who I like really respected or was really like a warm person or seemed like they meant to do good in the world. Like there was someone who worked at Time that was like that. And then he ended up, working like for the AIDS Foundation and something. They were always like leaving when they were between 28 and 32 to be a teacher. Like everybody, they were all like going to Rutgers to get certified to be a teacher when they like hit 30 and they kind of like had enough of that game, that like rat race in the city. And I just had this feeling like, well, if I know that's who I am as a person, if I know that's what's going to be most enriching to me, why am I going to wait? Shouldn't I just like go home soon, or shouldn't I go into teaching right away? And then it was just like, but how can I do that when I could have, I was one of the ones from my class that went away to school, and was like, I felt like I had to do something more unique or special in terms of my perception or the perception of others, that if I had, was going to be a teacher, I could have gone to Madison. It would have been much less expensive, So it just, so it was a real kind of struggle. And then I graduated during the crash. So like 2008, like that was my senior year. So everybody who had like internships that had led to job offers and everything, just were like spent a whole summer sitting on couches, staring at each other, and just kind of the whole world, seemed like it fell apart. And even internships that I had and then set up like the next person to have it, they were being paid to do what I had gotten like credit to do because they needed to like keep people there and didn't have the financing. And it was just, everything was about to change. Everything was about to go digital. It was this real moment of stress. And I was like, you know what, this isn't making me happy anyway. So there's no point in like fighting through this. And so I decided to go back, and I was like, I want to teach in a suburban environment. I want to be the kind of teacher that I had when I was like in middle school that was inspiring to me. And I want to be in that environment. So it makes the most sense for me to go home to the Milwaukee area and go to grad school there, become licensed, get certified, get my master's, and become a teacher. And so that's how I initially kind of found my way into teaching.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Right, that
And
was
like I pick up the sense that like, you in order for you to engage in any kind of like work or like study, you have to have like some kind of flame within you, and you're like kind of attracted to opportunities that allow you to kind of like build upon that flame, even when maybe from the outside perspective there's like, like society or like your peers might be saying go in this direction. A professor who's been mentoring you is like, well, you should go in this direction. And of course, there's like definitely like certain figures who like helped you to like see like these like pivot points and being like, yeah, if you're not wanting to do like kind of like politics, maybe you try like the English major route, go to NYU. But then there was like these other things that you spoke about that I thought were really great, because you wanted something that was going to enrich you, right? And to make you feel happy, as you said. And, kind of like arriving at teaching and into the world of education, it's not like you did away with all of those past, majors and internships and experiences, but they compound, right? And they kind
Yeah.
of create these layers. I'm like thinking of like a fossil, like, like cross section of like all these different layers, but there's like this incredible history that you can appreciate because you bring that into the classroom, right? Because you're
Yeah. And
right.
that's what I found too, that, when I was trying to kind of frame it, as like a narrative of like, well, why am I here? And it's like, well, I was pursuing publishing because I loved the idea of getting kids reading and how important that was. And I was like, well, am I going to make an impact in that more if I'm in a room editing one series of books, because that's what I'll probably end up doing if I'm pursuing publishing. I'm not going to be on the PR route because I interned in PR and found out like, no, I want to be in the editing route. Or do I want to be with kids in the classroom and kind of like instilling that love in, that love of reading, that love of learning, that kind of open perspective in them. And so it made sense why I enjoyed it. And, but then I like was able to use those experiences I had to navigate teaching in kind of a way that made sense to me, that then brought me to something that was really meaningful to me. Because I was a public school, because it was the crash, I like wanted to get employed no matter what. So I'm like, I'm going to get I'm going to be in the elementary program and the secondary program at the same time. Like, cause it was just that very scary moment where like everything, no one was getting employed and everything. So, I mean, I did everything I could to like be as employable as possible. So it gave me this like very vast kind of ability to teach different things. And then I ended up moving to the Chicago area, and I ended up actually getting a job at a private boarding school. And then it was interesting because all the license stuff that I had gotten wasn't even needed anymore. So I was like licensed up the wazoo. I was licensed in Wisconsin. I knew I had to move here. So I got all my Illinois licensure and everything transferred over. And then I got this job when I moved here, but it made sense because it was like, well, I'm Harry Potter obsessed. And I know one of the people in our cohort, she mentioned this on your program, but it was like, well, this is the closest I'll ever be to being a Hogwarts professor. Like, and that's what I am now, I am a Hogwarts professor in the Midwest at one of the only schools like that in the Midwest, because it's more part of Eastern culture. So, and it was neat because then after working there a few years, an opportunity opened up to be the journalism teacher. And,
Wow,
typically when
yeah.
what?
None of those experiences are wasted. It just kind of keeps getting pulled back
No,
up.
yeah. And so the international experience I'd had when I was young, suddenly I was working at the school with a huge, diverse international population. So the fact that I had grown up and I had been abroad and knew what it was like to live abroad as a student and how that feels, that was very applicable to this student population. The fact that I had work experience and done other things other than just like become a teacher, made it appealing, for just them when they're trying to create global citizens and as their students. And then, just so in my journalism background, typically when an English teacher becomes a journalism teacher, it's that someone has retired and then someone in that department gets that spot. It's very rare for like professional journalists to go become English teachers. So the fact that I had like been trained as a professional journalist and that I had all of this intern experience working at actual publications and that I could bring that into my teaching, it just made it really neat. And then all of a sudden it was like, wow, I'm going to all now get to teach what I love. I'm going to get to teach kids to care about what's going on in the world. And, and here I am, a political junkie and a news junkie, and I'm going to be able to expand this program and bring all of these kind of life experiences to that to enhance my teaching. So and I ended up being a coordinator, and then I eventually became the director of journalism and running this whole program. And I was there for over a decade, and then recently, because I want to pursue administration, and there I have more of an opportunity to do that in the public system, that I switched back into public teaching, because I was originally a public teacher in Wisconsin for a year. So now I'm in the public space, so that when I'm all set with that administrative licensure, and we're done with our admin program that we're in, then I can, pursue administration. So that's kind of my professional track that I've taken.
Right. Well, I just wanted to comment about I just think, again, along the lines of like, nothing is wasted in our experiences. It's so hard, especially from the early part of our career, to understand like, well, where is this decision really going to get me, right? And I'm sure that was something that you were probably like, thinking a lot about, maybe even agonizing, right, amidst kind of the turmoil, maybe the economic, recession and all of these things happening around you, where you were like, I need to cover my base. I need to, get, from a practical perspective, get X, Y, and Z done. But at the same time, you still, I would say, kind of overrided certain impulses and followed your passion, not knowing where that would lead you, to the point where at the boarding school, then, it's like suddenly everything's falling into place, right? Or like kind of like being put before you, and in a manner with which you probably couldn't have fathomed, like that would be the arrangement. Is that?
No, yeah. And then I ended up spending a lot of time in China while I was there, and teaching in China, which was, I mean, such a gift, and, so unexpected. And again, I, ended up doing it because I had so young kind of had this very, international perspective and this interest in the world. And I mean, I feel like that's a huge part of what it is to be a global citizen, that it's this need to engage, in the wider world, and an eagerness to do it. And I got the opportunity to help run an oral English training program for teachers in China. So doing professional development for teachers in China. And then we would, my mentor and I and a couple other people, we would go out to rural areas, like in the Shaanxi province, so we'd go to like Shanghai for a few days, and then we'd fly to Guangzhou, and then we'd like drive 3 hours north of there. And we were in an area that was a small town, or a rural area to that, to them, but really it was like a city of, 800,000 people or something like that. I mean, it was a city. So, but still the kind of the conditions that the, classrooms were in, that to be teaching teachers who've never had any access to a native English speaker, and yet they have to teach to their students, for their students to be able to kind of like function in a globalized world, or like the perception that they should have English to do that, or that they might need English to do that. And so many of these teachers were, riding for like 2 hours on a motorbike just every single day to come to this program in the summer that was a couple weeks long. And some of them would bring their children with them, because they wanted like their toddlers to be exposed to the native English speakers. And also, even though it seemed like it was a big place we were in, it was rural to the point where we would be walking down the street, and people would come out of stores, or once a dentist office, because they'd never seen a Westerner like walking on the street in real time. And just that, just the impact of like experiencing that and seeing that, and then thinking about, and a big part of why we did this is because, like, as the school had so many international students, part of it was to educate the educators, so that when we came back, we would understand more about what our students were dealing with in terms of like cultural difference, and just what that meant for them. So I went and I taught in this program these, teachers, and I did that for a few summers. And then another time I went to Chengdu, which is a city. I mean, that's a city. And then that was a very different population, where the teachers definitely, they had been to college, and they had been internationally, and had, maybe gone to university in Scotland or something. So then it was interesting to kind of see the difference, of their experience versus, the teachers that had been doing, every summer. And again, it just showing, that when we think of China, or when we think of the US, or when we think of Australia, like there's no one experience that is the identity of that country. And then really getting to kind of experience that as an individual, and then bring that back to, one's perception here, whether it's as a teacher or an administrator or just a human being. So that experience was really a gift. And so being in that boarding school allowed me to have that very special experience, that I obviously wouldn't have had otherwise. Yeah.
That sounds amazing. And you said that you did this over multiple summers.
Mhm.
And so it seems like it was of mutual benefit, right? For the teachers in the rural areas, right? In the different, cities that you went to. But then for yourself, this kind of, wake up call as far as like, what is the reality that, people in China are experiencing? And then kind of having that ability to then compare to what your reality back in the States is, or back in your, boarding school.
Mhm.
It's so important for us to be able to like have more appreciation for what we have, but then also about what we maybe don't know, right? The kind of like,
Yeah.
right, there's it's not going to be perfect in one place or the other, and it's not to kind of belittle them. And I'm not saying that you said that, or it kind of hinted at that, but I've seen some people like speak about, oh, I went to India and I saw poverty, right, or something like that, and then
Yeah,
they
that it's
kind
so
of pity them,
complex. It's
right?
so complex. I mean, just the cultural difference. I mean, just kind of like the norm of families, and just how families function, and like multi-generational family units being the norm. And just uh, like, for example, we'd be there, and how, all of these students in the class are adult teachers, and the majority of them are women. And it was interesting because in China, or at least where we were, it seemed that like the higher you went in education, or the better you did, that would be your rank in terms of like whether you were a high school teacher or an elementary teacher. So there were more men that were high school teachers than elementary teachers, and they were more educated. So I mean, that was really interesting kind of to see that play out, because then I would say like, oh, in the US, it doesn't matter. Like you pick which one you want to do, and just kind of the difference. And that was interesting. But to see that like the grandparents were taking care of the kids. Like that was just a given. It wasn't they weren't in daycares. It was, and of course there's people who have the gift of maybe having, grandparents that can do that here. But to see kind of like that is the way it is, that is the standard. And then how, the impact that has on the parents and what they're able to do professionally, and kind of then the tie to the family. And and then just to come back here, and when we're talking about the cost of daycare and being a parent, and issues with the American political system and our education system, it just shows like, wow, look at the value, that China was placing on allowing women to be able to go to work. They were doing it in a different way, but it was just interesting kind of seeing that. And then I ended up, very much kind of having feelings about that and connection, because then I ended up being unexpectedly and very suddenly a single working mom, which I wasn't, planning on, of course. So just kind of my perspective of that we all live very different lives, and we don't know what people are dealing with, on what's not on Facebook, and just kind of to realize that the complexity of people's experiences, and then having then dealt with a very complex experience here of like being a full-time working person in a city where my parents don't live, and having an 18-month-old and being alone, and just kind of like how that impacted my career and how that impacted what I could pursue. Because like I had wanted to go into administration and go get my admin master's like years and years and years before this program. And I was like ready to do it. And I was looking into DePaul and, in Chicago, and I was kind of ready to go. And then suddenly I was alone with a baby and working. And it was just like, well, that's and I've heard this too from other, people in our cohort, like that was no longer a possibility. That was no longer a feasible possibility. And then, I'm fortunate now, I ended up getting remarried and, but part of the reason that I've been able to do this program is because now I'm not alone, and just kind of like knowing, and I have two kids. But knowing that, that when we think of, oh, this is so easy, or, oh, this is just the way things are, or, oh, if people have a certain income or if people live in a certain place, everything must be fine for them and all that. And it's like, no, like you never know what people are dealing with, and just kind of having that openness of, perspective. And I think that really affected how I, felt about things like that, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And so, from that experience being in China and seeing, um, yeah, the way with which like the social or like the family structures were situated, and how that served a purpose, allowed you then to like understand from like your own experience back in the US that like, wow, like there are different ways of like approaching the kind of like management of having a child and setting yourself up in a career, or like what are the kind of pros and cons to that, and it ultimately gives you this heightened awareness of like or maybe like appreciation
Hmm.
of why like family is important,
Hmm.
right, and how that will look different in various cultural contexts, and so that like experience really imprinted on you, right, in a positive way because of that open perspective. So I also was thinking about when you were younger going to Australia for the first time, that was also a very pivotal moment for you to cultivate that sense of appreciation because of the differences that were coming up, right? Very
Hmm.
evident in the way that I think you mentioned, like returning back to your hometown, and you were just like, oh my gosh, like the trees look more beautiful, or I really appreciate the way this my school is like operating this way, or like you kind of
Or the
you
similarities.
learn
Just kind of
similarity.
then appreciating even about my own, in my own country. It's like, wow, from my perspective, of course, everyone can have their own view of how they grew up, but at least that from my perspective, I'm like, wow, how fortunate I am to have had access to a city
Mm.
my whole life growing up. How fortunate that I had access to field trips that saw theater, and that we could be at an airport in 20 minutes, and just things like that one wouldn't necessarily think of, but it's like that's not the experience of the whole country. So then to be in another country and then have a very different experience, it's like, wow, we have to drive 2 hours now to be anywhere near, a major city in terms of what like we would think of as a major city in the US. And that just the impact that has on perspectives, and how people, think about wealth, how people think about diversity, and just seeing that play out in different scenarios is just really enriching in terms of one's perspective, and just even like having, becoming close with some of the teachers that are teaching in China, and staying in touch with them afterwards, and then seeing their reaction to me, because like when I first went the first few times, I wasn't single, and I was married, and then it was like, oh, I'm getting married, and that whole thing. And then like the last time that I went, or second to last time I went, the last couple times I went, it was they couldn't believe that I lived in a city where like my mom doesn't live, because my parents are still in the Milwaukee area. So like they couldn't even conceive that I like handle that. And then that, and that, you know, I don't, and then I don't fit into what some stereotypes exist in the US of like the single working mother. Like, no, it's like, I had a very different job, and I live in a very different environment, you know, than what some might think that experience is here. And part of the reason I stayed where I was working for so long and didn't go back into the public system is because I could afford to keep my child in the daycare that she was in because I had housing at my boarding school. Whereas, like, if I went to another situation, then I might not be able to provide the same kind of like standard of living that, like, she and we had become accustomed to. So it's kind of like seeing how circumstances and decisions are made just in terms of life, but then also, seeing the women there kind of in awe of the fact that like I was okay living in a place where I didn't have help, but then also being in a work environment where, at the drop of the hat, it's like, oh, we need to go to this event, or we know, because it was a private school, so it's not public. So you're not under contract with the union. And, so it's like, oh, we need to go to this event and we need to go to this event. Again, lovely events. Wonderful. But just kind of the difference of like, oh, I need to get a sitter every single time I'm asked to do anything. And then seeing other people maybe able to rise in a certain way because maybe they're able to be more involved or give off the perception that they can be more involved in a certain way. And then like having the frustration of like, well, I'd like to do that. I'd like to lead that trip. I'd like to do these things that show I'm like all in, but I can't because I don't have help here. So it was just and again, there's no right or wrong. No one's ever necessarily doing something right or wrong. No, I would never say that the place of work was asking anything that's wrong in any way, but it just kind of shows that our experiences, across the world can be similar in so many ways, can be different in so many ways, and that we're all individuals kind of like dealing with these things regardless of where we're from.
Yeah. No, there's so much nuance to what you shared, like the struggles of being a single mother, of building up your career, and then of just also having some semblance of like a social life too. I mean, there's so many things
Oh
that
my
you need
God.
to have, that you would want,
Not
and
having guilt about. I mean, like I have such guilt now just being in our program. Like I was just talking to my daughter's pediatrician about this at her physical yesterday, and she like knew her shapes. I have my 2-year-old just turned 3, and she like knew her shapes, and the pediatrician was like, does she know her shapes, and does she know her colors, does she know her shapes? And when she said shapes, I was like, I don't know really, and I don't think so. And then she started like saying shapes, and my daughter started like saying, oh, circle and square and all of this, and I was like, and I felt so horrible. Like I just was like, oh, I've missed that. And it's like, well, and again, this is like a constant thing, but it's like, well, we have class multiple nights per week for 3 hours at a time. I often say to people like, because our program is synchronous, like it's not like we do it at our own pace. Like I'm always saying like I'm live with a headset on, like, multiple times per week, and then the work for that. So, my husband has had to step up and be like the primary person for a lot of the time, especially in the evenings, for our youngest child. And just that feeling of like, was that okay that I did this? And but I mean, but that same, like, is it okay if I go do something social, because shouldn't I be with my child instead? And just kind of navigating that. Yeah, it's a lot, but the Harvard program really put all kinds of things into different perspectives as well, just like getting into that and just how that totally changed the trajectory of what was versus now, like kind of what is. I know, I mean, have you found that? I mean,
oh yeah, but I think the word change that you just said is a constant, right? In your experience, I would say also in mine, in terms of the different possibilities that emerge, in terms of the reframing of what, a sacrifice we have to take, and then seeing it later down the line as like actually our greatest benefit. And the fact
yeah,
that, life is long, right? And we're pursuing various different goals, objectives. And I have no doubt that we will all reach them, but it requires that work. And I think, especially with like young kids being very observant, they take note of that, and that, it's not a bad thing to see struggle. But I do think that, your efforts to constantly, want that balance, or to like be there for those milestones, and like you're not missing out on everything. It's just that, no
no,
one's
no,
perfect, right? So give
yeah,
yourself credit.
no. I mean, I'm there and everything, and I mean, and I part of wanting to be an educator too was that after being in New York and seeing kind of what a corporate life was like in that environment, like I wanted to have a career too where I would be able to have more access to my children, and that did mean a lot to me. Just kind of seeing a lot of people who were working where they weren't allowed that privilege. So I mean, I mean that definitely was something that I wanted to be involved and have the ability to be involved in my kids' lives. But it's interesting because like I applied for like giggles. I didn't, I wasn't like ready to start that at that moment. And then I saw it and I was
The
the
master's program,
program.
right? Yeah.
What?
Oh, the master's program. You're saying you applied.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause I
Okay.
mean, it's like I was ready, to go. And then suddenly I was divorced. And then I was like, oh, and then I was ready to go again. And then COVID happened. And then, and kind of hit the point of like, I need to, I want to be in leadership now. Like I really need to pursue my admin masters in some capacity now. And then I found that online researching, and I saw it said something like you could apply like 3 times in a lifetime or something like that. And then you had to stop or something like that, like to the school. And I was like, well, I'll apply to Giggle because I just had a baby. And I was like, well, I'll apply for Giggles this time. And then next year, I'll legitimately apply to schools that like I actually think I can get into because, this is just whatever. So when I got in, I was like, oh my God, oops. And then,
Now you're committed.
yeah. And so I had like a new baby and I was like, oh goodness. So, yeah. But I mean, even like just kind of taking, I think, and the program has shown this even more so, but that the importance of taking chances, then you don't know exactly how it's gonna like flesh out. That right before the pandemic, I got the opportunity that one of my friends from college, and he's a news guy, and he was doing a startup, like a news service, and he wanted to have an educational arm of it to provide like a news service, to classrooms across the US. And he wanted me to, be the educational director and write the curriculum and align everything to Common Core because I had that background. And, I was thinking like, oh, like, I'm not going to make any money at this. Like, he can't pay me at the moment, when it first started. And I was like, is this worth even taking time away, from my child to do this? But I was like, well, this seems like, it's a really good experience. I really believe in it. I think kids should have access to information in the news and that we should encourage them to know what's going on in the world. So I care about this. So even though, again, like you said earlier, it might present some logistical issues, I want to be a part of this. And it's interesting because it grew while we were doing it, and it ended up kind of fizzling a bit during the pandemic. But it was interesting that being a part of that then, kind of led to the Harvard thing, I think, because that's something that definitely I was referring to on my application. It was like, well, I've served as like the director of education for this academic startup for kids to be engaged with the world. So, I mean, I do care about having an impact. So it's just interesting how like things you think will never amount to anything, or you don't see like a path at the moment, that they can lead to things that are unbelievable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're blazing forward your own path. And I think that's amazing, right? This kind of like risk taking, but you couple that with following your passion and trusting the gut, and knowing that, kind of as long as you're in motion, that you're not like stagnant, that, you will get to your, destination. But it's so much more than just, the charting the course, but it's actually taking the action towards that. And I really appreciate like throughout this conversation, from what you've shared about your story, you have always sought out new experiences, and definitely not like the easier path, right? Certain things maybe you felt were thrust upon you. Other things you very much intentionally put it out there, like applying for the Harvard program. And in both cases, though, it provided this incredible opportunity to continuously grow. And I think that very much resonates with global citizenship as well, right? Because when you think about it, right, we encounter differences, and we can choose to shy away from that and kind of not engage, or to, just kind of take it like a little bit easier. But you kind of like are able to understand like not just the differences, but like see the similarities, draw the connections, and then continuously push forward and see new vistas before you that I think really is inspiring, because people kind of fail to see that, right? Maybe that it's just whatever's in front of them, and then they don't realize they can just step to the left or the right, and there's something behind.
And you
People,
never, and that knowing, like, you never know, oh, this, and, when I was like, oh, I shouldn't do that internship, but it seems like a good experience. And then it ended up leading to like a much more satisfying teaching experience than it would have been if I hadn't been a journalism teacher. And like, even now, being around the other people in our cohort, who've accomplished so much, and it's so inspirational to hear their stories and be around them, that it's really changed like my aspirations and what I thought I wanted to do. And like, my goal was to be a principal. And now I even feel like I could go further than that. And like, I don't have any kind of entrepreneurial like spirit, I think, compared to others. And yet, after being in our entrepreneurial class and, partnering with one of our colleagues, and now we're, creating something, and we're creating this app to help teachers build community. And it's fascinating that called Teach Meets, and Lucy and I are doing this together, and it's very exciting. But we're involved in iLab, the innovation lab at Harvard, and we've applied to grants and done all this stuff. And again, like, I feel like, okay, it's this kind of like a time suck, and it's like, I don't know where this is going to go, and no, there's no money in this, and everything right now. But it just feels like, okay, that I need to take advantage of these opportunities. I need to, she inspires me to be aspirational, and that you can do things that maybe you think you can't do, and things might exist that you don't see in front of you right now. And it's just like, okay, I don't want to miss this moment. So even though I don't know what it's going to end up being, maybe it will lead to something else at some point, but I'm going to lean into this and follow her and be supportive of this. And it was interesting because we were in like the mentor match the other day for like the test level of iLab, and getting matched with a mentor that can help us, with our app and developing it. And it was just really fascinating because there was a technical difficulty, and they like didn't let Lucy, our friend, in the room. And then I was alone in the room to do the pitch. And it was, and here I don't like interviewing people, because I'm just like scared I'm going to say something wrong or something. And it was like, in that moment, I just had to like go. And afterwards, I was actually explaining to like my mom the other night, and she was like, why are you doing all this? And I was like, because it's an incredible opportunity. I was like, it's an opportunity to learn how to do this and to grow. And I don't know what is going to come of it, but it seems silly not to at least try. And that, and just having that kind of, I think, attitude towards the world and our experience and our careers and our children, and encouraging them, to do the same. And I mean, I've tried to really kind of, push my older daughter into trying different things, kind of like, it's okay if you don't like that, but why don't you try it? You never know. And just so, and having that kind of openness is so important.
yeah, and don't let these opportunities pass you by. Don't let life pass you by, right? And it's very
Yeah.
clear that you are putting up this investment of time and energy, but you've already proven to yourself from what you've shared in your story just on this podcast, that it has paid off dividends, right? And that it's been
Yeah.
worthwhile, and that, why, like, who says that, like, oh, now you have 2 kids and a family and like a mortgage, that you got to stop having dreams or aspirations, right? You're
Yeah.
pushing. And I think that's what's so inspiring, because most people opt out of that. And yeah, and again, I think this is all very very much tied to being a global citizen, and that you are kind of expanding, right? You're growing and you're influencing people around you, right? Whether that be in your immediate school environment or through an app, and through our cohort. So I really, really appreciate you sharing so much of your journey and your story. It's just been such a joy, Mandy. Thank you so
Well, thank
much.
you so much,
And
Scott.
I wanted to ask the final question, if you could just share really briefly a book recommendation for the listeners.
Um, yeah, I have like two that are very different. So what I'm reading right now, I'm reading Cast. it was suggested in one of our classes to read Caste. And I wanted to, it's Caste, like the origin of our discontents. And it's written by, here, I wrote this down. It's written by Isabel Wilkerson. She wrote The Warmth of Other Suns about the Great Migration. But it's about, how the caste system and just kind of how the structures of the U.S. were built, and and how race was tied to it, but then comparing it to like the caste system in India and comparing it to certain aspects of Nazi Germany. And I'm a big history fanatic, and so it just I love it because it's written beautifully, and I really appreciate like when a history book is written like with a really amazing narrative, because I mean I am an English teacher and all that, so I love that. But then I also would love, because I know that sounds like really heady because it's like, oh, it was written by this Pulitzer Prize winning author. But I'm a big fan of Bluey. Just like, not just as a parent, but as a human being. And I mean, in terms of global citizenship, I mean, the fact that a show about an Australian, family, this dog, but it's the Australian family, that this is now the top streamed show of 2024. Like this is worldwide, like the top show. And I think that it really says something about global citizenship, because the reason, I mean, there's many reasons, but one of the key reasons is Bluey is so popular is because it speaks to adults just as much, if not more so, than it speaks to kids, because it's about parenting and it's about like family dynamics. It's not just about, what the kids are doing. And like, for example, there will be, and there's an episode where like the kids are like playing a game called Pass the Parcel, and like, that it's been changed to be so everybody wins. And then one of the dads is like, what is this? This is ridiculous. Like only one person should win. And then the other parents are like, where have you been? This is how things are now. And then he wants to change it and it upsets the kids. But then over time, the kids like realize like, oh, actually it is more fun when there's winners and losers, because then you don't know what's going to happen. And I mean, it's about and so I mean, everybody can identify with these things. So the fact that like the whole world, I think, is identifying with this very simple show that shows that we all like have these same kind of feelings about things and approaches to things, I think just kind of also speaks a lot to global citizenship, that it doesn't have to be like an intellectual book. It can be Bluey.
It can be Bluey. Yeah. Thank you so much. What great recommendations. Yeah, I've actually never seen an episode of Bluey, but you have inspired me to check that one out. And I did read the cast book for the equity and opportunity class that we took.
Oh, really? Oh, isn't it good?
It was really good. Yeah, very well written. Everything you said, spot on. Listeners should definitely check that out too. So thank you so much, Mandy. I really appreciate the time you took to be on the podcast. And again,
thank you so much for having me, Scott.
Eloquent speaker. You rose to the occasion and surpassed. It was lovely. I wanted to give the last few words to you. So any final thoughts, or just a send off, just to kind of wrap up our conversation?
Yeah, something I thought about, and just as a news junkie and a journalism person all these years, is that a lot of times when people say like, "Oh, I don't watch the news because it's too upsetting," or I don't listen to that. It's just I don't do that. And just that that I think something I've learned from my experiences and in different international situations and teaching different international student populations and just life, is that that the things that happen globally, they affect us, whether you think they affect you or not. Whether you think that your kid is going to ever go abroad and get a rock thrown at them because of a war that you either did or didn't agree with, or, that when people say, oh, I don't want to engage with that because it's messy or it's icky, that, we're taught, especially in our program now, that in order to be leaders, we need to lean into difficult conversations and difficult discussions, that in order to be, an engaged person in the world, a global citizen, that we need to lean in to what's happening and an awareness of what's happening. And I would just encourage people that it is worth knowing what's going on.